This may be infuriating, but I'm about to talk about a possible future project of mine without talking about a possible future project of mine. See, for a long time, most of my writing output has consisted of novels and occasionally a short story that would get scrapped or abandoned. I wasn't really very good at the format, but I found novels to be a nice, comfortable way to do things, and also because they gave me what turned out to be the most direct route that I felt to getting my work in front of people, in the sense that I had total control when I self-published. I could put it out on my own terms. I could give it the packaging I wanted. I could give it the presentation and the schedule that I wanted, and so on and so forth. But before I really got started on that journey, which really started in about 2006, 2007 or so, one of the other things that I was dabbling in for a long time before that, without much success, was screenwriting. I had written a few screenplays over the course of several years, none of which were any good. And I am saying this completely without any regret whatsoever. I know they were no good. I don't have a problem with that, because you only get to writing good things by maybe also writing bad things first and using them as stepping stones. There was one project I started that was essentially an adaptation of a comic that I enjoyed at the time. It was never intended to be sold. It was just practice. And it didn't work out. About 2/3 of it was okay, and then it just sort of went off a cliff. And I said, well, I learned from that. You have to know where the whole story is going. And then I tried something that was an adaptation of a science fiction novel that I enjoyed, again, as practice. The whole point was not to sell these things. It was to understand the format. And that was easier because the work in question that I was adapting was already complete. So all I had to do was just basically learn how to condense it into about 115, 120 pages. And I actually managed to pull that off, and I was pretty proud of myself. But then I said to myself, the point is to try and actually write something original. And since I didn't have the money to option the thing in question, and I didn't really understand how things worked at the time in terms of, getting it in front of people, I said, okay, well, I've got to come up with something original. So I tried a couple more stabs at doing original screenplay projects. Guess what? Those didn't go anywhere either. They weren't very good at all. So I put all of that aside, tried to forget about it. And then a few years later came the whole course of events that eventually led me to starting what became Infinimata. I wrote the first book that I eventually released under that imprint. That was 2006, 2007. The rest is, as they say, history. But I never completely forgot about screenwriting. And I said, at some point I really want to go back and try this again, because I love the movies and I love the idea of trying to write something that was intended to be for the screen. But one of the things that had always bugged me about the whole process was the formatting. And I know that sounds like such a dumb thing to complain about. Screenplays have a very specific format. And if you do anything outside of that format, there's a very good chance you will simply not be read. And so a whole sub-industry has developed where people will sell entire programs, like Final Draft, for instance, that can be used to make the process of formatting the script more or less automatic. And there are also things like templates that have been developed for Microsoft Word or OpenOffice or other word processors that make the whole thing a little bit more streamlined. But I tried them. My original attempts were in Word, and it was very clunky. I tried creating my own macros and such to do it, and it was just, I was spending more time fussing with the controls than I was actually typing and telling the story. So I didn't really want to drop a whole bunch of money on a whole separate program to do this. I tend to be kind of married to my tools. I said, that's not really the best thing. So either you've got to pick up the tools that are going to help make this possible, or you've got to rethink this whole thing. And then some funny stuff happened over the past couple of years. The first was that I started using Visual Studio Code, the text editor, as a much larger component of my general workflow for the day than I realized. I still do all of my stuff in Word as far as manuscripts go, but I was using Visual Studio Code as a text editor for a lot of other things. And I started to get that much more comfortable with using it in some ways as a creative tool. I started to seriously mull the idea of switching to a plain text format for all of my future novels. But that part got put on hold for reasons that will become clear in a moment. What happened was, in the course of researching that particular set of tooling, I came across another set of tooling that I had never heard about before. There is a plain text format for screenwriting called Fountain. It is basically a variation of the Markdown format, if you're familiar with that, in the sense that you type plain text that has a relatively predictable format to it, and that the software will then translate your Markdown, pseudo Markdown format into a screenplay format and render it in real time. So you can actually have your screenplay plain text in one pane and a real-time preview in a PDF in another pane as you type. And my jaw hit the floor. I said, this is fantastic. I should try this out. So I installed one of the bigger plugins that's used for Fountain in Visual Studio Code. And just for fun, I started typing a scene. And then I started typing 2 pages, and I started typing 3 pages, and I started typing 10 pages. And I said, this is turning into an actual script. This is not just me goofing. This is a legit thing. And within about 3 or 4 days, I had 30 pages. And within about 2.5 to 3 weeks, I had a complete draft, a full feature-length screenplay. I had not even begun to estimate just how useful it would be to remove the friction of physically writing the thing. That once that was removed, once all I had to do was just type and have my intentions translated automatically by the software into formatting, I was not prepared for how creative I would get. And I found that I had a story that fit very nicely into the 2-hour feature film format that I had sort of been sitting on for a while. It had not really been given a chance to gestate completely, but getting the wheel turning, starting the typing, starting writing this first act and seeing where that took me, helped me hatch that egg that much more completely. And so by the end of 3 weeks, I had a full draft. And then I spent several more months after that coming back to it in passes, because I was at the time also trying to finish the 2 books I've currently got on my on my desk. And then I said, hey, this is working. And all of the things that I had learned about storytelling and also about screenwriting since the last time I had taken a stab at any of this had started to pay off in what felt like a real way. Now, I don't know if anyone else is going to think that it's a good script. I think it's an okay script. I think it's a perfectly decent script. I don't know that it's a great script, but it's certainly something that I'm willing to put my name to. And it's a first step. And that first step can lead to other steps. So my tentative plan is to keep doing this in between other projects where it's feasible. And then once I have enough things in that vein, to take them and start using them as a portfolio to say, hey, this is what I can do. And I honestly don't know if it's going to go anywhere. I'm trying to treat this whole thing in the spirit of one great big experiment. It's just to see what happens, because I have a very different attitude about this than I do about the novels. The novels are for me, and for you, of course, too. The novels are something that I do on my terms, with my time and my money and my effort. They're 100% my thing. But there are ideas I come up with that I am willing to turn into something that I can package and produce in such a way that they're meant for others, that they're meant to be sold. They're meant to be commodified. And as long as I still have my novels and a space to work on those in, that'll satisfy that urge. I'm not going to sit there and feel deprived. And again, I'm doing it all just to see what will come of it. Maybe nothing will come of it. But if something does come of it, I may end up talking about it here, depending on how much I can say. What I will say is that so far I'm pleased. I'm genuinely elated that one of the biggest barriers that seemed to be standing in the way of me doing something with this medium turned out to be more or less purely technical, and that once the right technical solution was in front of me, a lot of my earlier difficulties disappeared. And I also suspect, again, that was because in the intervening time, I've had that much more practice. I've had that much more of a sense of what a story is, how it's supposed to develop, who is supposed to be in it, how we're supposed to care about them, what kind of journey they're supposed to take us on, how it's all supposed to come together. And even though all of that has been in the vein of writing novels, which is obviously not the same thing as writing a screenplay, the two absolutely don't map to each other, no matter what they tell you. The practice mattered, being able to think about story mattered, being able to think about character mattered. The venue, the vessel, the box that they were all being put in was completely different, but just having that much more practice generally was a big boon. I also want to take a moment to talk about one of the books that I read that turned out to be very useful in helping me shape these ideas and give them a good form in what I think is a relatively sellable screenplay. The book is called Writing Screenplays That Sell by Michael Hauge. At least I think that's how his name is pronounced. And this was last updated about, the last copyright date is 2011. So it's been a bit since, but all of the advice that is in there about story construction and character and story development and emotional arcs and all the rest of it, those are pretty much timeless. There's a lot of business advice in the second half of the book that's also probably a little bewhiskered, but I think most of it is still valid. But all of the stuff about constructing the script and getting the most out of the idea and putting it into a form that is commercially accessible, this all still seems to be tremendously valid. And the book was sitting next to my desk whenever I was writing the script, and I would be opening it and going through it and saying, okay, I think I can do this better based on what he's saying, or, oh yeah, I already did that. I was actually fairly pleased by how a lot of the things that I sensed intuitively were correct or incorrect as I was going turned out to be things that were called out in the book as being the right or wrong thing to do. Like one of the biggest things that you don't want to do is you don't want to give us somebody to whom things happen. You want to give us somebody who is going to be the engine of change. And they're not just going to be the engine of change for the events in the story, but an engine of change for themselves from within. Because unless they change a little bit from within, they're never going to completely figure out how to change things from without. Now, there's one other thing that I haven't talked about at all, which is what my story is, what my script is, or what are the other projects that I've been considering that are possible screenplay ideas. And that's in big part because I don't like to talk about stuff that's still under wraps, that could change, that could go somewhere unpredictable. I tend to sit on those things until they're fully and completely a thing. And I think that matters at least as much here as it does anywhere else, because I don't like to make false promises about what something is going to be. And I also don't want to ruin surprise. If one of these things ends up going somewhere, great. If all it does is open doors and I don't actually, make a sale or anything, but it does get me, under the aegis of a manager or an agent or something like that, then maybe I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, because there's a chance it may not get made, then it will probably get repurposed into something else. But all of that I'm saving for much further down the road. Right now, all I'm thinking about doing is finding things that will fit nicely in this format. And yes, many of them are science fiction, many of them are fantasy. So there will be lessons learned from that to be talked about more generally on this channel. Although, again, I'm going to try to do it in a way that won't ruin any surprises. So to think about stories that can fit into the screenplay container, whether it be for a feature film or for perhaps a TV series, depending on which way the chips fall, and then getting lessons from those and talking about them here further, but one thing at a time. Meantime, I've got 2 books to finish, and they're staring at me right now from a pile that's on the other side of the room. I've got proof copies I've still got to go read and mark up, so I'm going to get to that. So I hope this was interesting and intriguing, and let me know what you think about the whole business, and until next time, stay curious.